All right, so we're kind of wrapping up our little journey through this idea of who Abraham is. As we're looking at this, we're in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 13. What it says is this: the Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Listen to that. God is who he says he is, and he does what he says he'll do. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time that God had told him. Now look at that. At the time, at the appointed time, God had a plan. It wouldn't have been appropriate for him to have a son at 86. He had a different plan. He had a different objective. The first point I want to make for you all today is this: God is who he says he is, and he does what he says he'll do. Verse 3, Abraham named his son who was born to him the one Sarah bore to him, Isaac. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. It's interesting now, here this plan is coming to fruition and Abraham is doing exactly what God had commanded. See, at this point he knew God's plan really is right. It's hard to know that before it starts to come out, but what I want us to see is that God's plan is right. That's our second point there. Verse 5 goes on, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. God's plan doesn't always make sense. That's our third point. So far, we've seen that God is who he says he is and that he does what he says he'll do. The second point is that his plan is right. The third point is, it doesn't always make sense to us. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. She also said, who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son for him in his old age. I want us to understand that God is not restrained by our resources. See, their bodies were used up and old. They weren't available for things like childbearing and nursing. Yet God isn't dependable on what we can give. He is dependent on who he is and the resources he has. Verse 8 goes on, the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, drive out this slave and her son, for the son of this slave will not be a co-heir with my son, Isaac. This was very distressing to Abraham because of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And I will also make a nation of the slave's son, because he is your offspring. The final point that I want us to see here is that sin, though God is faithful and though he is gracious, still has consequences in our life. Sin and a lack of faith still has consequences. So, what would I encourage you to do today? Hear his plan and obey. Trust him to be who he says he is and do what he says he'll do. His plan is right, even if it doesn't make sense to you, and he's not dependent on your resources to do it. He's the one who's going to be moving. Follow him today.